we're going to talk about RF safety. So what? From shared application. I never saw that before. What's it trying to tell me?
Sure,
It's being paused. Why?
they're out of time.
We've just got a big blank screen here.
Yeah, it says something's going on. I don't know what it is. I'm recording.
Are you recording?
Yes.
Well, turn that off and turn it back on again.
Well, there you go. Sound like a Windows user.
Yeah.
If all else fails, restart.
Control delete.
Okay. It says I'm screen sharing. Can you see me now?
Sure
Yep,
can.
looking good.
Doing good.
I don't know what that was about, except,
It happens.
yeah, but now I can't start the show. What's going on?
You can't record it.
It's recording,
So start with.
but I can't show the slide.
Hmm.
All right. We'll try again. Let's see. We'll start with that one. Okay. Says we're sharing. Yeah. Weird stuff going on with my computer today. All right. Everybody seeing the screen?
Recording. Still recording?
Yep.
Yeah, it's red, blinking. So it says we're okay. We basically have two kinds of ionization. There's ionizing radiation and non-ionizing radiation. Fortunately, all of the ham radio frequencies fall in the non-ionizing radiation part of the band. Ionizing radiation kind of starts at ultraviolet and up. You know, gamma rays, X-rays, all that kind of stuff that comes from the solar wind. And those, because of the frequency, those waves have enough energy that they can actually cause damage to cell DNA. We're not talking about a shock or a burn, actual, well, the same kind of thing, you know, you get with nuclear. It's the same kind of waves and frequencies. So you're talking about stuff that can kill you. In the case of non-ionizing radiation, we're talking about heating of tissue, you know, RF burns, things like that. Particularly the soft tissue, things like your eyes and some of your internal organs are more susceptible than other parts of your body. I guess that could actually cook your eyeballs. I don't know. But fortunately, the worst is like heating and burns. So what type of radiation are radio signals?
Delta,
This is your favorite.
Delta,
Delta Airlines.
How does RF radiation differ from ionizing radiation?
Alpha,
Alpha looks good. Yep, Alpha.
Okay,
You're not gonna become the Hulk or the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle.
yeah,
That's right.
okay. The FCC says that the station licensee, and when you get your license, you really get two. You get an operator's license and a station license,
Control. Okay.
right? But it's called a station license or station trustee. The
Does that mean
station
we're-
license,
does that mean we're one and the same? It's station.
yes and no. They're one and the same by default. However, you can delegate a control operator to somebody else.
Mm.
Okay.
Okay.
Does that make- And we talk about that in a week or two. But the station licensee, which is only you, okay, and you're responsible to ensure that nobody is being exposed to excessive RF radiation. And there's some limits that are set by the FCC. And there should be a chart coming up here shortly showing those. They give you 3 ways to determine that you're in compliance. And one of those is some calculations based on this FCC bulletin, which I think is basically like what the calculator on the ARRL website does. You can go there and bring that up and input 4 or 5 parameters like the duty cycle and the frequency and what type of antenna and things like that, and it will show you what your exposure distance is for the maximum exposure, both for controlled and uncontrolled environments. Controlled is where it's in your space. You know where the antenna is pointed and where it is and all that stuff. Uncontrolled is for other people, like your neighbor. Okay, you may have your antenna pointed at his house or her house. They don't know they're getting radiated. That's uncontrolled. So it's a lot less allowable exposure than exposing yourself to your antenna. So you can calculate it with some of the online calculators. You can do some computer modeling, things like the EasyNEC or NEC programs that do that kind of modeling. I don't know that hardly anybody does it that way. Or you can go out and actually measure the field strength. You need a calibrated field strength meter to do that. Most people don't have access to that. It's not a cheap piece of equipment. So most people are going to do it with one of these online calculators. So who is responsible for ensuring no person is exposed to RF energy above the FCC exposure limits?
Bravo.
Bravo. Which of the following is an acceptable method to determine whether your station complies with the FCC RF exposure limits?
Delta.
Delta. Delta.
Delta. Okay. One of the factors that you use, like I mentioned, is duty cycle. It's the percentage of time that you're actually transmitting. So if you are doing something like an FT8 mode, it's approximately 50% duty cycle. So it decodes for 15 seconds and then it transmits for 15 seconds. Most of your other modes like single sideband and FM, it's a much lower duty cycle. I mean, you don't talk at full modulation for half of the time. Probably what, 25-30% maybe?
Yeah, again, whatever time period when you're in a conversation, it may be back and forth for 30 seconds, but in an hour's time, you're not making that many contacts typically. You're turning around listening for 10 minutes, then you talk to someone for a couple of minutes, and so. Yeah, what's your average duty cycle over an hour would be pretty low.
So the duty cycle is going to determine your average exposure. So if you were doing 100%, then if you were 50% duty cycle, your exposure is half. Right? If you're doing 25% duty cycle, then it's going to be a quarter. And that's one of the questions coming up, that it's inversely proportional to the duty cycle. So you could have 4 times the power at 25% duty cycle, or twice the power at 50%. And they're going to calculate your radiation power as milliwatts per square centimeter. In other words, that's how much RF energy there is in a square centimeter. So you can't exceed 1 milliwatt for controlled in the 30 to 300 range. What is the definition of duty cycle during the averaging time for RF exposure?
Charlie.
Well, that was quick. What is duty cycle? Why is duty cycle one of the factors used to determine safe RF radiation exposure levels?
Alpha.
That one took longer. How does the allowable power density for RF safety change if duty cycle changes from 100 to 50%?
Bravo. Um,
What's your second
Then-
guess?
Charlie.
Charlie.
All right. Did you read-
Really?
Did you read
Well-
them too quick?
I was with you, Bob. I thought the same thing to start with.
Okay. Like I mentioned, the human body absorbs RF energy at different levels. It's kind of frequency dependent. It turns out that in the HF band, or excuse me, the VHF band, that you're most susceptible. So the 30 to 300 megahertz frequency range is where you can tolerate the least amount of exposure. And they kind of pick 50 megahertz, which is kind of in the middle of that range, not exactly the center, where your body absorbs the most radiation, the soft tissue. So you have to worry about the frequency. If you're in that maximum exposure range, then your acceptable level is a lot lower than it is on the lower frequencies or the higher frequencies. How far you are from the antenna, because it's a exponential. The farther away you get it, it goes as a square function. and also the radiation pattern of the antenna. If it's a dipole or a vertical, you've got a omnidirectional radiation pattern, so that 100 watts that you're transmitting is distributed around that entire torus or donut. If you've got a beam antenna like a Yagi, it's all concentrated in one direction. So even though it's still 100 watts, the power density is much higher because it's compressed into a smaller area. And that's one of the things when you do the calculation is the type of antenna, what the radiation pattern is. This is a chart I mentioned. There's been some recent additions to it, but basically it hasn't changed. So in the range we're talking about, in the 30 to 300, we're limited to 1 milliwatt per square centimeter. Your neighbor can only have 0.2 milliwatts per square centimeter because they don't know they're being radiated. So they could stand there in that position for a long time, not knowing it, where you have the option to move around, move the antenna, whatever. At the really low frequencies, you can see how it goes up 100 milliwatts per square centimeter down here in the AM broadcast. So you can get close to an AM broadcast tower, closer than you can to a VHF. And then as you go back up into the really high frequencies, it goes back up, so it's up to 5. Why do exposure limits vary with frequency? Come on, Brenda.
Higher frequencies.
Well, I would say delta.
There you go.
Delta.
At which of the following frequencies does maximum permissible exposure have the lowest value?
Bravo.
Bravo.
Bravo. Okay.
In the 30 to 300. What factors affect the RF exposure of people near an amateur station antenna? It's another Brenda question.
I would say delta.
Delta. Delta. Wow, Delta's
Uh,
there.
You should regularly evaluate your station's safety. They recommend that whenever you change anything that could affect the radiation exposure, like a different transmitter, a different antenna, you move the antenna to a different spot, you start running a mode you haven't done before, like you don't even doing voice and you decide that you want to play with FT8, you need to do a separate calculation for FT8 because of the duty cycle, even though nothing else changed. So you need to do the calculation for all those different options. And if you've got possibly more than one radio, I mean, you might have a VHF, UHF, and you might have a HF radio. You mean have something else, multiple antennas. You have to do it for all those combinations and modes that you might use. You're supposed to have that information available if and when the FCC guy comes knocking on your door to inspect your station. It's probably never going to happen, but according to the FCC rules, it could. Although I think they tell you they're coming. Unless you're one of those people that were abusing things and they're gonna come and arrest you,
Have
fine
you
you.
ever been evaluated?
What?
Have you ever been evaluated?
No. They don't have enough FCC offices or people to do it.
That's what I thought.
However, there's been cases where people have either licensed or unlicensed really abused certain frequencies and stuff, and became, particularly when they hindered some commercial operations, and the FCC cracked down on them and like $50,000 fines and took away their license and stuff. So they can do serious stuff, but the little infractions that we might do or coming to inspect your station is probably not going to happen. Unless somebody doesn't like you and keeps reporting you, maybe.
Yeah, I've done both, so I've calculated all according to the FCC, OE65B bulletin, I've gone and done the ARRL website has a calculator, which is much simpler
Mhm.
than, but I created a spreadsheet based on that FCC bulletin before the ARRL calculator was ever there. And I found the ARRL is a little bit more lenient for whatever reason, I don't know the math behind it. So if it says like, so for a mic, this band and whatever, I need to at least be 12 feet away, the ARRL would say I need to be 15 feet away. So I go with the more restrictive one because I use both methods. I can throw the bulletin stuff away just about the ARRL, but it's an interesting exercise. You gotta, like I've got attic antennas, so they're fairly close.
Nice.
These are in the controlled environment. And I found you don't really need to worry too much. I mean, you need to do the analysis because we're supposed to, but 10 meters, 6 meters, and you gotta remember we're authorized 1,500 watts without running nowhere near that, but
Mhm.
if you're running 1,500 watts on 10 meters with an attic antenna, there's several places in the house you don't want to be sitting watching TV for too long. My wife can't be there, so my antenna's over the long version. And I explained that in some of my documentation, say that's a transient area. She walked to it from the garage, nobody's in there for long, or
She's not gonna get mad if you tell her to stay out of laundry room.
but anyway, that kind of thing, you kind of think about that. Of course, you gotta
Yeah.
figure out, well, even sitting at their station, because I'm permanently there when I'm transmitting, right? So how far am I? You gotta use a little Pythagorean theorem kind of stuff to say what's your line of distance to your antenna. So it's kind of, fun little exercise to figure out and everything. But generally, unless you're really running, I found it really running some serious power with a pretty close antenna at 10 to 6 meter range, is where
Yeah.
you might need to think about cutting back your power or moving something or doing something, but. And then for the uncontrolled is working, I did it like to the front door, to the garage door, to a power meter, who might come to your yard, I mean, the bug guys bring your, people are in your yard sometimes, so. Just what's from the antenna to the closest outside wall of my house, and someone uncontrolled could be there.
Mhm.
And say,
Yeah.
calculate that as the uncontrolled part of it.
Probably worst case is if you've got a beam antenna like a Yagi or something on a rotator,
Sure.
and you're running 1,500 watts, and it is pointed at your neighbor's house, that, depending on how far away that is, that could be an issue. Also, I did the calculation for my handy talkie, and I was surprised, depending on what duty cycle you put in, you could exceed the limit doing this for a
Yeah,
period of time.
You have to talk straight for 10 minutes, you might be getting more, you might be exceeding your.
Which may be why they limit it to 5 watts, because if you went up, 10, 15 watts, I'm sure you'd have to talk like this. Which of the following actions can reduce exposure to RF radiation?
Delta.
Are you sure about that?
It looks good. Relocate antennas, relocate the transmitter,
Oh,
increase. I'm not sure what duty cycle is. What's duty cycle all about?
Well,
Okay.
that's percentage of time you're transmitting.
That
Oh.
would be alpha. Yeah, alpha, you can't read.
Alpha.
You
Right,
can't
the
read.
transmitter location doesn't matter.
No, it doesn't matter.
Okay.
It's the antenna.
Gotcha.
If you change the power on the transmitter, it matters. But just moving it doesn't matter.
Okay.
And increasing the duty cycle makes it worse.
Right. Oh, okay. Gotcha.
So it's definitely not delta.
Okay. Relocating antenna. Alpha.
Too bad, Brenda. No delta. How can you make sure that your station stays in compliance with safety regulations?
Bravo, I would say.
Yeah, never do A.
No.
Bravo. Bravo.
Bravo. Yeah, you'd just be bothering the FCC, I guess, if you informed them. They'd say nice, but okay, so we talked about the difference between ionizing and non-ionizing radiation. So all of the radio waves with frequencies above microwave get into the ionizing radiation. Your ultraviolet, part of the light spectrum, X-rays, gamma rays, all the other things physicists keep finding on high energy particles, because they can actually do cellular damage and DNA damage. That's the problem with nuclear radiation exposure. It affects your cells, messes up your DNA. The licensee is the one responsible for ensuring that you're within the limits for radiation exposure. You can't blame it on anybody else because it's the station. It's not the operator. It's the station that's responsible. And you are the station licensee.
Yeah, you're all the same.
Yeah.
There's 3 ways to calculate it. Duty cycle is probably that and radiation pattern, probably the 2 biggest factors that affect it. That radiation exposure is frequency dependent because parts of your body absorb more energy at some frequencies than others. 30 to 300 megahertz is the most susceptible frequency or frequency range, which happens to be the VHF band. You're better off on 70 centimeters than you are on 2 meters. Frequency and power affect the exposure, distance affects it, radiation pattern affects it. Relocating the antenna can affect calculation. Obviously, getting it up higher, you'd have less effect on your neighbor than if it's down low, pointing right at their house. And whenever you make a change in anything that would affect the radiation pattern or exposure, you need to redo the calculations and ensure that you're within the acceptable limits. Okay.